One of the things about Edward VIII, or the Prince of Wales as he was in those days, he projected this wonderfully charming image. Women wanted to dance with him and a little bit more. Mothers hoped that their daughters would catch his eye and dance with him, and a lot more.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Hunter, and I'm the head of programming here at the Appel Salon at the Toronto Public Library. I'd like to welcome you all tonight. We're going to have a great chat with Jennifer Hunter from the Toronto Star and Andrew Morton, who is the best-selling author of a number of books and has arrived in New York last night, or this morning, I think, and arrived in Toronto here and has been doing some media. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob Hepburn, my esteemed colleague from the Toronto Star. And with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Bob Hepburn.
Thank you for coming. Toronto Star has been sponsoring these Star Talks for about 5 years now. We've had everywhere from Rick Mercer to Margaret Trudeau. We never did get Rob Ford to come and be a Star Talk. He's available now, that's true. My role here tonight is to introduce Jennifer Hunter and Andrew Morton. I gotta have notes because they both have long, long careers. Jennifer is a veteran journalist, an editor with a wealth of experience after years of covering authors, political leaders, including a politician known as Barack Obama before he became famous. These days, Jennifer is one of the Star's top feature writers, which she displays every Sunday in a column that appears in our book sections. In that column, she focuses on authors in Canadian fiction and nonfiction from across the country and from around the world. Before becoming a columnist for the Star, Jennifer was our foreign editor, managing bureaus from Jerusalem to Washington, Beijing to London. And prior to joining the Star in 2008, she was an award-winning political columnist and editorial writer for the Chicago Sun-Times, a time when she also made appearances on CNN and shows such as The Today Show. Over her career, she's been an associate publisher and editor-in-chief of the North Shore magazine in Chicago, bureau chief in Vancouver for Maclean's magazine, an associate professor of journalism at Ryerson, and a reporter from another local paper named the Globe and Mail. Andrew Morton. Well, I don't think anyone in here really needs an introduction to Andrew Morton. There may be 3 people who don't know about him, though. He became an international best-selling author and a royal biographer only after quitting his day job as a journalist, after having worked for 3 of London's biggest newspapers. He rose to worldwide prominence with the publication of Diana, her true story in her own words. In later years, Andrew authored biographies on such celebrities as Madonna, Tom Cruise, I like that one, Monica Lewinsky, Angela Jolie, soccer star David Beckham and his wife Victoria, otherwise known as Posh, who were then known as the king and queen of pop culture. That book was a #1 bestseller in the UK and elsewhere. In 2011, Andrew returned to writing about the royals with a book, William and Catherine, Their Story. And now he has just published his latest royal book, I'll call it a royal book, 17 Carnations, the royals, the Nazis, and the biggest cover-up in history. It's about Edward VIII, that woman named Wallace, and Hitler. It's a book that took him 3 years to write with the help of 4 researchers. As Andrew said in an interview with the Star's book editor, Deborah Dundas, which appeared last Saturday, quote, "It's got everything. It's got intrigue, it's got cover-up. In many ways, I uncovered a lot more than I ever expected." Tonight, Andrew Morton, always controversial, always fascinating, will tell you what he uncovered. Please welcome Andrew Morton, Jennifer Hunter.
So I'm going to start from the beginning of your book. And what I thought about Prince Edward when I read about him in your book was that if People magazine and Style had been around, that he would have been featured every week because he had, as you say, matinee idol looks, personal charm, scads of money, but he wasn't a happy man. What was going on in his life?
Yes, one of the things about Edward VIII, or the Prince of Wales as he was in those days, it's fascinating really because it all started here in Canada when he came in 1919, and he saw a different vista to what he was used to at Buckingham Palace. It was a freer country, there was more opportunity. He really enjoyed himself, so much so that he bought a ranch in Alberta that he hoped to retire to. But he projected this wonderfully charming image. Women wanted to dance with him and a little bit more. Mothers hoped that their daughters would catch his eye and dance with him, and a lot more. Gentlemen looked at what he was wearing and they went down to their local haberdashers and bought it. So he was a charismatic figure. He was the royal version of the then silent matinee idol Rudolph Valentino. And when he appeared in public, and there's pictures in the book from Halifax, Nova Scotia, he looks the image of the 1920s icon. A cigarette in his mouth, a big smile, cheery smile, everybody around him looking very happy. But away from the public, he was miserable. He was depressed, he was often suicidal, he was morose. When he was on these long tours around the empire that his father, George V, sent him on, he would spend his days in his cabin, depressed. He hated the very idea of what he used to call princing. And that is to say, doing this kind of thing, standing around, walking amongst you, shaking hands, doing the glad handing. He hated it. He just longed for what his favourite word was, informality. And in a funny kind of way, it all started with Canada, because Canada for him was a different world to the world he was used to at Balmoral, at Sandringham, which was so stuffy. He then went to New York, had a great time, had a ticker tape parade. George V took a pretty dim view, though, when it was revealed that his equerry, a chap called Fruity Metcalf. I mean, you can't make these names up, you know. He's like a character out of Downton Abbey. Anyway, they found his wallet in a prostitute's bedroom in 92nd Street. George V thought, that's a bit too strong for our future king, and so he banned him from going abroad. So thereafter, going to America. So thereafter, this morose future king was confined to barracks, as it were.
What was the relationship with his parents like? Queen Mary, his mother, and George V, his father?
Well, when you look at the offspring of George V and Queen Mary, it's quite a dysfunctional family. You have his younger brother, the Duke of Kent. He was apparently bisexual, had affairs with Noel Coward, was involved in drugs with a girl called Kiki Preston. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that there are no papers, no correspondence, no letters in existence either at Windsor Castle or elsewhere. Strange that, isn't it, that this bisexual royal who led a very colourful life, there's no record of it. His other brothers, the Duke of York was notoriously a stammerer, not particularly quick, and Edward was quite bright, but he had a very chilly relationship with his parents. Chips Channon, the famous diarist, he used to say that talking to Queen Mary was like addressing St. Paul's. And so, he was, and they were a distant couple, and that's an understatement. And in fact, Edward learnt to crochet because his mother crocheted, yes, in order to kind of be closer. It's kind of pathetic, really, to be closer to his parents. So, and at school, standard, he was bullied. They poured red ink into his hair. On one occasion, they pulled up the sash from the window, put his head in, and did a mock execution. He had one nanny who used to stick pins in him. So, this was a dysfunctional family. If, you'd have social workers full-time there.
I should just mention that Colin Firth played the Duke of York as George VI, right in the King's Speech. And
let me let you into a secret. There was a film made about the Diana book a few years ago. It's called The Biographer. And they used to say to me, well, who would you like to play you? And I said, as a joke, because I'm 6'4", Danny DeVito. but they then asked Colin Firth, because he's better looking than me, and he turned it down, sadly, to play George VI. So there you are. That's a little bit of film history for you.
Since Queen Victoria, it was accepted that English princes and princesses would marry into German royalty. When Adolf Hitler began to encourage a union between a German princess, Frederica of Brunswick, and Prince Edward, the only thing that was really strange in this plot was the matchmaker. Why did Hitler put so much stock in the future of the British Prince of Wales?
Well, as I chart in the book, this is a curious love affair, a distant but intimate relationship between the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, and Adolf Hitler. I think the only thing they had in common was that their fathers were very distant. Adolf Hitler's father used to beat him when he came back from the beer garden. But Hitler had a very Victorian point of view when it came to dynastic unions. He thought, well, Queen Victoria, what's good enough for Queen Victoria is good enough for me. She always used to rule that an English prince had to marry a German princess, and so Hitler looked around and thought, right, Princess Frederica, she's 17, Duke and Duchess of Brunswick, ardent Nazis, Prince of Wales, bachelor, let's put them together. And then we've got an ally on the throne of England. The Brunswick family, the Duke and Duchess, were horrified at the idea of this because there was a 23-year age difference. The Prince of Wales was rapidly approaching his 40s, and Frederica was only 17. So Hitler really saw Edward, he was almost like a cat, idly watching a mouse at play, just kind of, almost like Tom and Jerry, one of these cartoons. Because Hitler used to watch all these cartoons, all these Disney cartoons, watch Mickey Mouse. And the only time that he wasn't doing that, he was watching Pathé newsreels of Edward VIII, of the Prince of Wales, of Edward. And Goebbels used to bring, his propaganda minister, used to bring these canisters of film to his mountain retreat and he'd sit there in his leather chair and watch Edward. It was a kind of a curious relationship.
Wallis Simpson was American. She'd been married twice, and during the time she met the prince, she was having an affair also with a Ford used car salesman. She wasn't pretty, she wasn't rich. What was it about her that dazzled Prince Edward?
Well, that's a good question. I got some, when I was doing the research for this book, I got some newsreel or some film made by a chap called Herman Rogers, who was a great friend of Wallis Simpson, and I actually believe that she was rather in love with him. He was a very attractive American playboy, really, who was married to Catherine Rogers. And he took lots of footage of Wallis Simpson. And I agree with you. When you look at pictures of Wallis, she doesn't look too great. She's a very manly. There's nothing particularly vivid about her. But then you look at the films that he made on board the cruise ship at Balmoral, and she's vital, she's alive, she's full of fun. And I think that's what attracted Edward to Wallace. Of course, there was all these rumors around that when she was in China, in Shanghai and Peking, during the 1920s, she worked in a brothel to make ends meet, so to speak. And she learned all these, shall we say, exotic techniques. I can see that is anybody under 21 here? And she learned these exotic techniques which she applied to Prince Edward. Now, let me say this. When Edward and Wallace were about to marry, there was a book out called Coronation Commentary, which suggested that Wallace and Edward had been lovers before they married. Now, Edward was prepared to sue. He said, "I did not have sex with that woman." and this is the curious thing. Wallace Simpson is supposed to be the sexiest woman alive, and yet they seem to have a very platonic relationship. And Jennifer, you've mentioned Guy Trundle, this used car salesman who was a very good dancer. At the time, hence the title of the book, 17 Carnations, at the time, she was also supposed to be having an affair with Hitler's right-hand man, a chap called Joachim von Ribbentrop, a rather pompous, self-important but charming diplomat who was sent to London to woo Edward. Well, apparently he also wooed Mrs Simpson and used to send her 17 carnations, a bouquet of 17 carnations, these big bouquets of flowers, every day to her place in central London. Well, and then I mean, she was throwing these bouquets of flowers out all the time because Edward was also sending these flowers as well. So she was a very busy girl. That's all I can say about Wallace Simpson.
But the 17 carnations, I was going to ask you about that. The number of carnations, like it wasn't a dozen carnations or 2 dozen, it was 17.
It was 17 carnations because that signified the number of times that they'd actually done the deed. And in fact, this wasn't just like hearsay. It went wildfire around London, around the diplomats in Berlin. In fact, Hitler summoned Ribbentrop back to Berlin to explain himself. And I mean, you can imagine the scene because Hitler did not have a great sense of humour. But even he found it amusing that he was supposed to be having an affair with the king's lover. So he was going above and beyond his duty.
Someone said to me, couldn't he afford roses?
Well, I have to say, speaking for myself, I do not find carnations the finest of flowers. They're okay if you are a used car salesman. And, but let me just finish this. Guy Trundle, this guy who's allegedly the lover. Now, how did they know about this? Well, the King and the Prime Minister, Baldwin, were so concerned about what was going on with Edward and Mrs Simpson and Ernest Simpson, they thought that Edward was being blackmailed. Because here's this couple of American arrivists, just, nobody knows anything about them. They've arrived here. Edward's buying diamonds for sapphires, furs, the rest of it. And so they sent Scotland Yard's finest, a chap called Superintendent Canning, to follow Ernest and Wallace around. Now, Ernest was boasting to people in the pub, I'm going to be made a baron. Wallace was out shopping with Edward and calling each other darling. And he made this pretty pungent report to the Commissioner of Police, and this was believed at the time, 1935, Silver Jubilee, King George V Silver Jubilee, and they thought that Edward was being blackmailed by these 2 American arrivists.
When the prince became Edward VIII, he renounced his throne for, the famous quote, "The woman I love." But this really irritated Hitler and the Nazi hierarchy, so tell me a bit about that.
Well, I mean, Hitler thought he had a guy in place. He had the man in the top job. He believed that by being on the throne, you also had incredible political influence. And these are what the historians call the respectable years of the Nazi Party and Hitler. And he was basically softening up British public opinion, softening up the high society, softening up politicians, and also softening up Edward, so that when he invaded the Rhineland in March 1936, in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, Germany lost the war, and Germany very cleverly made it seem like they were equal partners between Britain and Germany by using people like Edward VIII to invite Ribbentrop and others into their for dinner and so on. And Hitler thought, well, this is great. I've got my man on the throne. And after the invasion of the Rhineland, Edward summoned Baldwin, the Prime Minister, and said, I don't want you to do anything. I don't want you to interfere at all. Now, it meant that Hitler was home and hosed, because the week before he ordered the occupation of the Rhineland, Hitler had spent the weekend in his mountain retreat, pacing up and down, trying to decide what to do. And you can imagine, Hitler and the Nazis weren't as powerful as they became. They faced a lot of internal opposition. The military units were not very strong. They didn't have much petrol. The whole thing was pretty ramshackle. It was an audacious move on his part, a really audacious move. He put all the money on getting 7, and he got 7 because France did nothing, the British did nothing, and historians say that if the British and the French had acted against Hitler, goodbye. So it was very important that Hitler sees Edward on the throne. So he was devastated when his pal Edward abdicates, and he's baffled. Hitler's point of view is he wants the Third Reich to be the greatest German empire the world has ever seen. Here's a man who already rules over the greatest empire the world has ever seen, and what's he doing? Walking away from it for a woman he'd never had sex with. He'd never, I mean, call me old-fashioned, but it's not a very good bargain.
The Windsors, the family, essentially turned their backs on Edward VIII after he gave up the throne and he married Mrs Simpson. His successor, our Queen Elizabeth's father, George VI, did not want his elder brother to even live in Britain. They refused to accept Mrs Simpson or give her a royal title. In fact, Queen Elizabeth's mother, also Queen Elizabeth, called her that woman. None of the royals would attend the wedding, and his family just turned their backs on him.
That woman was a compliment compared to some of the things that she said. Lowest of the low. George V's right-hand man, his private secretary, thought that Wallis Simpson was a vampire. Another courtier, and this is all serious, thought she was a witch. Queen Mary went to see a psychologist who convinced her that Wallis Simpson was a sexual hypnotist. Well, I'd love to meet one of those. So the royal family blamed Wallis Simpson for everything. And to give Wallis Simpson her due, here's this woman from Baltimore. What does she know about British society? What does she know about European politics? Not an awful lot. I mean, as you know, most Americans think that London's a suburb of Paris. I mean, it's not really within her bailiwick to know this kind of thing. Yet the royal family blamed her, and she very presciently said, they'll blame me for it, which is one of the reasons why she never wanted to marry him. And Edward was besotted with Wallis, but Wallis could see the trapdoor opening, and she could see no way of escaping it, because yes, she was enjoying all the diamonds and the sapphires and the furs and the rest of it, because as far as she was concerned, he was a very generous host, and she was acting as his hostess. But when she was at the height of the abdication crisis, she said, no, I don't want to, I will step aside. And, it's Edward that pursued her, but it's Edward that was not blamed by the royal family. The royal family loathed Mrs Simpson, and quite frankly, so did most of the British public. And she did not have the face that launched 1,000 ships. So as a result, she was seen as the other woman, this woman who'd somehow used her sexual magnetism to draw him away, when actually, as we said earlier on, he never wanted to be king. His nanny wrote to Queen Mary and said, see, I remember him as a little boy saying he never wanted to be king. And we forget that he'd had these grand passions before with Frida Dudley Ward and Thelma Furness, where he'd written endless love letters to these two Americans. I'm so dippy to die with you and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to read, never mind to write. And so Wallis Simpson, to be fair to her, she never expected he would renounce his throne. She never even had to consider for a moment she'd be queen. She just thought that she was one more lover on the conveyor belt of his life. But the conveyor belt stopped December 1936.
And her husband just seemed to step aside too, Ernest Simpson. He didn't block the way.
Well, as I say in the book, I think that Ernest Simpson had been having a long-term affair with Mary Raffray. Mary Raffray was an old school friend of Wallis Simpson's and had comforted Ernest on his business trips to New York. So I rather think that what happened is that Ernest decided, okay, I'm going to leave Wallis. I'm not going to pay for Wallis. I don't have the money. It's the depression. My shipping business isn't doing well. I'll ask, and there's this extraordinary scene between the king, the new king, and Ernest Simpson, where Ernest Simpson says, will you take my wife off my hands? and he kind of gets off his chair and says, how do you expect me to rule without her by my side? Okay, just write me a check. And that's roughly how it went. I mean,
but now the new Duke and Duchess of Windsor were very enamored of the Nazis. In fact, many of the privileged English aristocracy were enamored of the Nazis. And they believed that the Nazis were a good thing because the economy of Germany had been fractured after World War I, and the Nazis were doing things to improve the economy and build Germany. Today, this seems like a very strange and disturbing point of view, to think that the Nazis were a positive force, the way the British thought of them.
Not really. Look at the devastation caused by the First World War. I mean, I don't want to talk about today's foreign policy, but we all think, well, what's happened in Iraq and elsewhere? Do we want to send our troops into harm's way again? Well, have the same argument, but there's been millions of people killed on the battlefields of Europe during the First World War. Do we want to have another European conflagration some less than 20 years afterwards? Well, the answer is a resounding no. And so, I mean, Edward had seen the horrors of World War I at first hand. There was a famous story where he steps away from his chauffeur-driven car, goes to look at no man's land. By the time he gets back, his chauffeur's been killed because there's been a shrapnel burst. So he sees how the difference between life and death is very slender. And also, Hitler was seen to have brought stability to the Weimar Republic, which was, as we all know, they were carrying their wages home in wheelbarrows because of inflation. He hated the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, remember, they shot Tsar Nicholas II and his family during the revolution, and Tsar Nicholas was Edward's godfather. And he saw that Hitler, had brought stability to Germany. It was a bulwark against the Soviets, and so he hoped that they would one day slug it out and leave Britain to have the empire.
The Duke's relationship, though, with Hitler went beyond what was socially and politically accepted. He went so far as to even meet Hitler. I think, was it at Hitler's home in the mountains, summer home? and gave him a Nazi Heil, and he liked the deference that the Germans paid to him. Hitler had bold plans for the Duke.
Absolutely. Yes, the first major visit that the Duke and Duchess made after they married was to go to Germany. And she was treated like a queen. It was a royal visit. So here's Edward thinking, well, I've given up my throne, but I'm not going to give up the trappings. And so what does he do? He goes to Germany, where they call the Duchess Your Royal Highness, a title that George VI and the rest of the royal family refused to confer on her. They were curtsying, they were bowing, they were meeting the local German aristocracy. They were deferred to. There were big crowds in the streets. And let's not forget, Edward was a terribly charismatic man. He had great appeal, and that's why the royal family were so horrified that he'd gone, because, quite frankly, George VI did not seem physically or mentally up to the job, and they were horrified that Edward, who had all the attributes of being a glowing king, had walked away from the job. And then they see him going to Germany and parading himself through the streets, doing modified Nazi salutes, as though he's kind of like a shadow king. And then finally this kind of relationship between Hitler and Edward is consummated when they meet in his mountain retreat and speak for some 50 minutes. And as they were leaving, Hitler turned to an aide and said, well, Wallis would have made a very good queen. And they were never off his radar, ever. There was a moment during this, and we'll maybe come on to this in a minute, but there was a moment during the Second World War where Hitler, Ribbentrop and Goering went to Chateau Condé, which is where the royal couple married in 1937, and they went to the library. There were two portraits of the Duke and Duchess, and they stood there solemnly and gave them the Nazi salute. So it was respect from one group of soldiers for another. Well,
the Brits were very upset about this, and in your book you quote Lord Caldecott, Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs, who wrote that there was a grave uneasiness about the Duke's inclinations because he is well known to be pro-Nazi and he may become the center of intrigue. We regard it as a real danger that he should move freely on the continent. Even if he were willing to return to this country, his presence here would be most embarrassing to His Majesty and the government. In fact, this was true. The Duke had become the center of intrigue, and the Duke and Duchess sought refuge in Portugal during the war, but Hitler tried to lure them to Spain, and that was part of the intrigue. Can you explain?
Yes, yes, indeed. Edward and Mrs Simpson were the center of intense Nazi machinations. What happened is that they were in the south of France. They had a villa down there, and the Nazis were coming down through France. The Italians were on the French border, and so, of course, as you do when you're an ex-king, you call up the local British embassy and say, can you send a destroyer to pick me up? But bizarrely, there were no destroyers available. For some reason, there were busily carrying troops from the shores of Dunkirk and worrying about the fact that the Nazis were 30 miles away from Britain's shores. So he was told to make his way to Spain. Makes his way to Spain. Of course, it's a four-car convoy. One van is just for their luggage, 266 pieces. I don't know why they travel so light, quite frankly. But anyway, they get to Spain, and of course, Franco-fascist Spain, of kind of a neutral but ally of the Germans. And there then starts a series of haphazard incidents which culminate in this plot to drag the Duke and Duchess into the Nazi orbit. The plot is called Operation Willy. And the idea is that the Duke and Duchess will be inveigled away to stay in Spain, and the Duke, who they all saw as a man of peace, would stand in readiness for when Hitler wanted to use him and bring him and to restore him to the British throne as king. Now, Edward did everything but say, yes, please, because his behaviour was extraordinary, to say the least. First of all, remember, he's a major general in the British Army. He made silent and sly and very secretive contact with the Nazis and said, would you please look after my rented home in Paris and in the south of France for the duration of the war? Now, he didn't even own these houses, he was just renting them. And then Wallis got in on the act. She said to the local American consul, look, I've got a really nice swimsuit. It's in the chateau in the south of France. Can you send somebody around to pick it up? And so somebody goes around, picks up the swimsuit, and brings it back. And that operation was known as Operation Cleopatra Whim. And not to be outdone, Edward then asks, again through a contact, asks the Nazis, can we send our maid to Paris? We've got some wonderful silverware and some very fine linen that we need to be picked up and brought back for us. So the Nazis, now remember, this is at a time when, in the bigger picture, Halifax, Butler, other British politicians are quietly seeking a peace deal. So what are the Nazis thinking? Well, we're thinking that Edward is all part of this. He's contacting us. He's also talking garrulously around the dinner tables of Madrid and Lisbon. Well, only heavy bombing will bring Britain to the negotiating table. My brother, George VI, is stupid. The Queen is conniving. Very disloyal, treacherous, some would say treasonous. So all the signals were going out to the Nazis. All you have to do is knock on the door and they'll come running. They offered the Duke a castle in Ronda, a palace in Ronda in the south of Spain, very nice too. 50 million Swiss francs, about $200 million today, although I noticed the Canadian dollar's down a bit, so probably about $1 billion. Anyway, so the Germans took this very seriously indeed, and at the time, the Windsors were totally in the doghouse with the British government. Churchill wrote to Windsor and said, unless you obey orders, you could face a court-martial. And the orders were, get your asses out of Europe and go to the Bahamas where you're going to be governor. Effectively into banishment. And that was a word that Churchill used. And so during this period, there are all kinds of skullduggery. Hitler, who took this plot, Operation Willy, very seriously, he sent his top spy master, a chap called Walter Schellenberg, to kidnap them from Lisbon, bring them to Spain, where they would be kept under armed guard, under arrest. And Edward and Mrs Simpson were in very bad odour with the British Embassy. They kept away from the British Embassy. They thought they were going to be arrested. The British Embassy held their passports because they thought they were going to flee. So relations were at an all-time low. And then the Nazis started feeding information, which the Duke and Duchess believed, that they were about to be assassinated, that the British government were sending them to the Bahamas so that they could be bumped off. And they believed this. So at this critical moment, it could have gone either way, but as it was, they agreed to go to the Bahamas, but only after the Duke had insisted that 2 soldiers would be withdrawn from the British Army to act as his manservants whilst he's in the Bahamas. And you know what it's like when you're in the tropics. It's hell's own job to dress. You need a man to help you. That's why he got these 2 manservants. Of course, forget about the defence of Britain and Dover, White Cliffs. No, we need our manservants to look after us.
Well, they seem to be, the 2 of them, in La La Land. The fact that she's asking for her bathing suit, her green bathing suit, I think, to be delivered, and her linens, and he wanted,
what some people would do for a 600 thread count.
After World War II, everyone discovered that the Duke never believed the British could win. And he even, you talked a bit about this earlier, proposed replacing his brother and becoming a sort of presidential king of a sort. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Edward said all kinds of things. He believed that he could be restored to the throne. He was standing in readiness to act as Edward the peacemaker. And I cannot emphasize enough what a talisman for peace he was. George VI had negative charisma. Edward VIII was an international figure. And for example, at the start of the war, a wildfire rumour went round Germany saying that Edward had replaced George VI as king, and that he was suing for peace. Factories stopped, people ran into the street, they were embracing one another because they believed in Edward. And during the 1930s, he was a very, very popular figure. And so for him, he just thought he was doing the right thing by acting as a kind of peacemaker. Forget the fact that his brother was the king and that he was basically living in exile, but he pursued that aim.
I'd like to get a bit to the subtitle of your book, The Royals, the Nazis, and the Biggest Cover-Up in History. So I wanted to ask you about the biggest cover-up.
Yeah, it's understated title, I think. Basically what happened, that all this we may never have known this, but for the fact that the Germans kept very meticulous records. The German Foreign Office and the various ambassadors in Madrid and Lisbon sent their reports back to Berlin. And so all this information about the Duke and Duchess was there. And what happened at the end of the war, a file of a microfilm was discovered in a battered tin box in a country estate in Germany. They went through the microfilm, and here's conversations between Ribbentrop and Molotov, the Russian foreign minister, between Franco and Mussolini and the Japanese. And the British and the Americans thought, whoopee, this is pay dirt. We've got all the evidence we need to show that the Germans were behind the Second World War. They orchestrated it. They're the ones to blame. Our sacrifices have not been in vain, and that the rest of the world will see the justice of our case. And then they're going through it. What's that? Windsor file. Oh dear, now what do we do? And so there then started this enormous cover-up. How do we stop these documents about the Duke of Windsor, which would be terribly embarrassing for him? Remember, this is 1945, the concentration camps had just been emptied, the hideous contours of the Nazi regime had just been unveiled, and people are really beginning to appreciate what this war's been about, and the awfulness of everything. And that would have been devastating, both for the Duke of Windsor, but also for the monarchy, because they did not want the monarchy to be stained by association. Remember, he's an ex-king. So Attlee, the Prime Minister, Churchill, the war leader, Dwight Eisenhower, the head of Allied Command, the Foreign Office Minister Bevin, all agreed these files are toxic, these files do not represent what the Duke of Windsor really felt, let's destroy them. But the Americans had a copy. There were 2 copies made, and the State Department had it, and various historians and academics who were deputed to the State Department said, hang on a minute, you cannot be destroying history. You can't destroy, this is the historic record. It's against the law, and it was against the law. So the State Department said, well, sorry, chaps, but we can't destroy it. And it started a long process where the special relationship started to be strained and stretched as academics and civil servants and others were pitted against one another, because there's an awful lot of distrust then, because the British were disbelieved. But the British thought every action that the British took, the Americans thought, it's because they're trying to hide the Windsor file.
When did the world learn of the Duke's perfidy? When did that become public?
Well, what happened is that they, in conjunction with trying to destroy the file, they also decided to publish many files. And it took 12 years before they got round to publishing this file. Now, that was in 1957. And by then, obviously George VI had passed away. Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, and the Duke of Windsor by 1957 was a fairly marginal figure, a playboy prince, people counting how much luggage he took with him from Palm Beach to Paris to the south of France. So when it came out, he was portrayed very cleverly by the Foreign Office as the victim of all this, but not someone who was in any way active, that the Nazis had this terrible scheme to lure him away, but he'd been a stalwart defender. And you have to ask yourself the question, if it was irrelevant, if these files were irrelevant, if indeed the Duke of Windsor had nothing to answer and nothing to fear, why on earth did the British spend so much political and diplomatic capital in trying to destroy them? And that is what I've found the most fascinating thing about this book, that they spent so much capital in trying to destroy these files.
It was really historians who put a stop to it, though. They started to write about it.
Yeah, it was just a Stanford University professor called David Harris. He took on the government Goliath, as it were, and said, we're not going to have this, because we've seen what the British do in the past. They've destroyed important documents relating to Queen Elizabeth I's love life under the orders of Queen Victoria. You cannot destroy the historical documents. And we've seen the terrible events in Syria, where the ISIS has been destroying these statues and so on, destroying history. It's just, and this is what the British were trying to do. They're trying to destroy history. And as a historian, it's something that it is sacred. And in fairness to the translators and the archivists of Germany, they were ordered to destroy the documents on pain of death, and the SS were there looking over them and making sure that they did it. But what they did, because they believed themselves that the archives were the bones of a nation, what they did was they burnt the duplicates and hid many of the originals. And that's why so many of the war criminals at Nuremberg were found guilty. They were found guilty on the basis of their own evidence, on their own documents and on their own papers.
Which had been hidden. Finally, what do you want us to take away from this? What understanding do you want us to have?
Well, I think that one of the themes of my working life has always been the difference between image and reality, the fairy tale and lifting up the stone to see what was underneath. And it's the same with this. Initially you're thinking about, this is the great love story of the 20th century, the man who gave up his throne for love. These two royal lovers, and we're not talking about Kim Kardashian and Kanye West. We're talking about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And then you see what's really going on with their relationships with Hitler, but also with the British establishment, because you see that the British mentality is always to reach for the blue pen, to censor, and the Americans is far more towards disclosure.
Okay, I think we should turn to the audience now.
Andrew, thank you for being here. It's just terrific. As you can see from all the crowd, a hypothetical question. If the Duke of Windsor Edward VIII stayed on the throne, and when he died, George VI had died, would it have then gone, I've always wanted to know this, would it have then gone to the Duke of Gloucester, and then the Gloucester sons, and so our Queen would never have come into the thing? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, that's a good one. I always hate those kind of questions, because I'm rubbish on all these family trees. But I would have thought it would go to Elizabeth. Yeah, it would go to Elizabeth.
Because it went through the brothers first, didn't it?
Yeah. If he'd have stayed on the throne, would we be sitting here today, I wonder?
Oh, I know.
In fact, there's a some of you, if you've been to London, you know Trafalgar Square with the 4 plinths and Nelson's column. There's a 4th plinth that's empty, and there's a theory that because Willy Simpson did us a favour and took Edward VIII away from our shores, we should have a 4th plinth dedicated to Willy Simpson.
I was there last week, and it was a blue cockatoo or something.
That's right,
that was
yeah.
in that
That's
corner.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you. What I'd like to know is, what was the most startling fact that you uncovered that really shocked you?
Well, what shocked me was what I've just been talking about, the fact that it's 12 years that Churchill... In fact, I was shocked by Churchill, quite frankly, because here was a man who had really fallen out with the Duke of Windsor. He saw him as a surrogate son. Like his son Randolph, he'd always given him great leeway. And Edward behaved really badly during World War II, and Winston Churchill was sick of him. And in 1945, he was prepared to destroy the historical record out of deference to Edward VIII, even though he used the historical record himself, cabinet papers and so on, to write his story of World War II. Which eventually won him the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think in 1952.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Andrew.
Hi.
I feel very privileged to be here this evening, and my question to you is, it's been a fact that, as far as I had heard even from childhood, that Edward obviously was an advocate of the Nazi final solution and was an anti-Semite himself, and I'm wondering if you would be kind enough to elucidate about that very important aspect of the war and Edward's compliance.
Well, I think Edward and anti-Semitism his anti-Semitism was similar to that of many of the British aristocracy. They weren't allowed in their clubs, and neither were Roman Catholics, and quite frankly, it wasn't until well into the Queen's reign that any Jews and any Roman Catholics were employed. So there's a quote from one of George V's friends who said, I don't consort with Jews and Asiatics. So it was an easy racism, and the British aristocracy and Edward was no different from many aristocracies around the world.
But I'm more interested in as far as his attitude or anything that would place him as encouraging or at least applauding Hitler's motivation for the final solution.
Well, I mean, first of all, the final solution was not agreed until the Wannsee Conference in 1940. So, and by then, Britain was at war. So I don't think that would really apply to Edward. What I'm saying is that he had a general view, but to kind of conflate that with the final solution, I think is a bit of a stretch.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to ask if in your research you discovered anything about the death of Prince George and the connection to the Nazis, and also the relationship between King Edward and Prince George.
Well, that's a good question. And we're talking about the Duke of Kent, who died in 1942. His relationship with Prince George was very close until the abdication. And the irony is, and also, Prince George was acting as a kind of a backdoor peace negotiator on behalf of the king, George VI. And I've always thought that if Prince George and the Duke of Windsor had worked together, they may have had some kind of influence. But what was happening is that Prince George was working on behalf of the king, trying to bring about some kind of peace negotiations before the war started with the Germans. They had a great relationship before he abdicated. After he abdicated, they never saw one another again, apart from a very brief period, a week in Austria. And in fact, he was in Lisbon at the time that the Duke of Windsor was sent there. And when he was asked, "Do you want to see your brother?" he said, "Good God, no." And that was it.
Go to Yvonne now.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much. Andrew's going to be signing books at the back of the room, so there may be an opportunity to quickly bring a question to him if you still have one when you're at the back. Please join me in thanking Jennifer Hunter and Andrew Morton for a very good evening.